The afternoon of April 17th, 2026. An afternoon that should have been a symbol of Midwest peace turned into an atmospheric massacre in just a few hours. 54 tornado reports converged in a coordinated attack. 28 actual beasts made landfall, tearing apart everything in their path. In Wisconsin, 2 EF3 tornadoes, among the top 3% of the planet's most devastating storms, performed a devastating wipeout. Wind speeds exceeded 136 miles per hour. Entire residential areas in Marathon County were ripped apart, reduced to rubble of wood and insulation in less than 90 seconds. Homes that had stood for generations vanished, as if they had never existed. If you superimpose these numbers onto an average April day, you find no comparison. You only find a void where normalcy once existed. But here's what's truly chilling. Despite the sheer destructive power, the casualty figures were surprisingly low. That wasn't luck. It was because the forecasting system had read the storm before it even formed. The atmosphere on April 17th wasn't acting randomly. It was reading a script written over a decade ago. A script turning to a new chapter where natural disasters are no longer isolated incidents, but a schedule. If this is just the atmospheric warm-up before El Niño officially emerges, what will happen when the main event begins? Report your location below, what time it is, and do you believe all of this is just a coincidence? We need to know the truth, before the next page is turned. Most of us carry a mental model of natural disasters. A tornado outbreak is a closed-loop event. It arrives, wreaks havoc, then leaves to make way for sunshine and recovery efforts. But 2026 is breaking that rule. The April 17th system is not actually over. Days after the last tornado dissipated, the system's fingerprint is still etched into the landscape. Rivers in Wisconsin and Kansas are still roaring under flood warnings as massive rainfall continues unabated. At the same time, a harsh cold front is sweeping in, dragging temperatures down by 15 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Fields just emerging from hibernation now face a new threat. Late frost and snow falling on once green lawns. In a normal year, the atmosphere would reset after a major outbreak to accumulate new energy. But by 2026, that pause had disappeared. The atmosphere wasn't catching its breath. Instead of dissipating, the systems were overlapping, recharging on the very foundations of still wet disasters. By April 23rd, this reloading had created what meteorologists call a quad hazard event. These weren't 4 separate weather stories. This was a single atmospheric body extending its brutal tentacles across the continent simultaneously. Tornadoes erupted in the Midwest, blizzards raged in Montana, wildfires blazed in Texas, and flooding intensified in the upper Midwest. At the heart of the chaos was a deep, high-pressure trough, pushing ground pressure down to 987 millibars. This was the power of a massive winter storm, injected into the body of a spring system. Its warm side drew moisture from the Gulf of Mexico to fuel the tornadoes. Its cold side enveloped Canadian air to create the blizzards, and its dry line turned Texas into a giant matchbox. A complex system is one where everything unfolds in a disorganized manner, but April 23rd was about coordination. Every element was in its intended place: the dry boundary, the warm zone, and the cold air current wrapping around. This was frightening not only because of its power, but because it was behaving with the precision of a blueprint. The machine was running, and it seemed no one could turn it off. If you want to see the true face of the 2026 tornado season, don't look at the clouds, look at the calendar. Between April 1st and 5th, a series of outbreaks swept across the central United States. Next, from April 9th to 16th, a second wave of attacks appeared. And right after that came the terrifying peak on April 17th. Now, a new system is emerging from April 22nd to 26th, with April 23rd as the epicenter. Look at the intervals between them. About 6 to 8 days for each major event. Not 5, not 12. Exactly 6 to 8 days, time after time. Randomness in nature often creates these sudden gaps and surges, but this bizarre regularity isn't the behavior of a chaotic atmosphere. It's the signature of a cycle, a mechanism. This is what we call the unspoken rhythm. The jet stream, a massive river of gas at tens of thousands of feet, is locked into a fixed configuration, constantly pushing bursts of energy from the Pacific into the mainland. What you're seeing is the wavelength of the Rossby waves. 6 to 8 days is the time it takes for one trough to leave and the next to enter, fueling the next wave of destruction. A single disaster frightens you, but a recurring disaster will exhaust you. In the Midwest right now, communities aren't living in mere risk anymore. They're living in a schedule of risk. When you know exactly when the next storm will load, the fear turns into a form of lasting psychological trauma. Don't mistake them for individual storms. These are different batches, produced from the same assembly line by the same atmospheric machine with no pause button. The real question is no longer when the next outbreak will occur. The question is, when will this machine finally stop? The 6 to 8 day rhythm is not just a number on a weather chart. For those on the ground, it's a fragmented recovery period. Normally, after an outbreak, a community needs weeks to clean up, repair the power grid, notify insurance companies, and get children back to school. But in 2026, the atmosphere deprived us of that precious respite. This is where disaster began to conspire to overwhelm us. When the April 23rd outbreak struck, water from the April 17th storm hadn't yet drained from the drainage system. The land was saturated, air masses were still electrically charged, and jet streams remained locked in place. The new system didn't attack a blank slate, it attacked an already cracked and unrepaired infrastructure. The worst consequences will likely be in agricultural areas. Crops that had just awakened from their winter dormancy during a brief period of warmth are now battered by frost and late snow. Waterlogged soil prevents machinery from planting, completely disrupting the planting schedule. The damage now stems not from a single event, but from the accumulation of a series of cascading natural disasters. But something even more fragile than the power grid or the crops, the collective psyche. Warning fatigue begins to emerge. When the air raid sirens sound for the 4th time in the same month, people begin to experience decision paralysis. The feeling of not having a normal to return to plunges society into extreme tension. The central idea here is brutal. A recurring season of extreme weather not only destroys property, it destroys our very resilience. Each reload comes a little earlier, a little stronger, making our civilization resemble a boxer being repeatedly struck in the same wound before he can even get back on his feet. To understand the strangeness of 2026, we need to look at what should have been the epicenter of the destruction, Dixie Alley. Spanning Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, it's one of the most dangerous tornado regions on the planet. Here, storms typically form at night while people sleep, hidden behind a thick curtain of rain and moving at the speed of a race car. Usually, March and April are when this region screams the loudest, but 2026 is unsettlingly quiet, an eerie silence. Dixie Alley is experiencing its least active spring in half a decade. Tornado reports have plummeted, and risk maps that were once painted red are now just blank spaces. To the average observer, this is good news. But to meteorologists, this is the clearest fingerprint of a system being manipulated. Energy in an atmospheric system doesn't just disappear, it simply finds a new home. Dixie Alley's silence isn't due to luck, but because it's been deprived of its raw materials. All the moisture, wind shear, and instability that should have created outbreaks in the south have been shifted to the plains and Midwest. The southeast is underloaded, while the Midwest is overloaded in a perfectly symmetrical geographical arrangement. This is the negative clue. Dixie Alley's silence is the remnant of the same pattern wreaking havoc on Wisconsin. It confirms that the atmosphere is strictly adhering to a rule established by the state of the Pacific Ocean. As the Pacific shifts, America's risk map is rewritten. The absence of storms where they should be is the strongest evidence yet that the 2026 tornado season is no accident. It's been orchestrated. When risk not only increases but also shifts locations, it creates a new kind of danger. Areas less familiar with the power of EF3 are now facing a harsh reality. America's risk map is being redrawn in a way we were never prepared for. The geography of the danger has been unleashed. Instead of a band of extreme weather running through the deep south as traditionally envisioned, 2026 is drawing a sharp, fiery, and wind-strewn arc across the heart of the continent. The center of all action has shifted. From the plains of Texas, it sweeps through Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, and settles in the mountainous forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota. This is no longer a forecast, it is a geographical invasion. Not only are the storms moving, the very fuel that sustains them has been diverted. Moisture from the Gulf of Mexico is still surging, but it's being pulled hundreds of miles further north before encountering the necessary cold air shear and lift to create an outbreak. The current jet stream is acting as a precise guide rail, parking low-pressure systems at the same area code time and time again. On a national scale, the total number of tornadoes might look like the normal average, but that's a dangerous illusion. While Dixie Alley enjoys an eerie calm and lack of load, the Midwest is drowning in extreme weather. This is a zero-sum game of atmospheric energy. One region is standing on the sidelines, while the other is relentlessly assaulted by a system that refuses to leave. This isn't just a weather map, it's a map of vulnerability. When risk shifts to areas less familiar with this intensity and frequency of extremes, the cost is multiplied. We're witnessing a radical reshaping of where risk resides. The rules of where and when you should be afraid are being rewritten, and as we've seen, the atmosphere is a very fast pen. Let's start with the numbers. On April 17, 2 EF3 tornadoes made landfall in Wisconsin. In a normal year, this would be the state's biggest weather story, as Wisconsin isn't traditionally a hotspot for tornado clusters of this intensity. But in 2026, this is just one data point in a much larger and stranger picture. The secret isn't in the individual events, but in how they stacked on top of each other. We had a spring with a record number of outbreaks, occurring in a rhythm of 6 to 8 days without error, shifting further north and west than historically expected, while the southeast remained completely silent. One anomaly might be random, two might be a coincidence, but when you multiply the probabilities of all these anomalies together, the number you get is practically zero for an atmosphere behaving randomly. We're no longer looking at noise, we're looking at a signal. The hypothesis of chaotic weather has now completely failed. The statistical strangeness of this spring is so pronounced that it forces us to acknowledge a truth. Something is orchestrating these anomalies. There's a common thread running through it all, a systemic mechanism pushing every piece into its proper place. And the reason you feel this year's tornado season is strangely orderly is because it's actually unfolding exactly that way. There's a very common, very instinctive reaction to what we're discussing. April always has tornadoes. This is how most people react to the record numbers of 2026. Tornadoes in the Midwest, flooding in the plains, wildfire warnings all fit into old familiar patterns of spring in our minds. We take it for granted, and that familiarity is the perfect cover for a systematic catastrophe. The human brain is programmed to track events, not to recognize patterns. When you watch a clip of a tornado, your brain simply notes, another tornado. Events are filed as individual entries in memory. Without a conscious effort to stack them on a map and a timeline, you'll never see the geometric structure of the entire season. We are observers of events, not script readers. This is where the perception gap opens. The public sees the news and thinks, yeah, that's what April in the Midwest is like. But meteorologists and climate scientists are looking at layers upon layers of data. They track the rhythms, they calculate the statistics, and they see what the naked eye can't see. They see an atmosphere operating with astonishing precision, concealing its structure within seemingly random events. The 2026 tornado season might seem normal at first glance, but when you peel back that familiar layer, what you find underneath is an atmosphere reading a script written more than a decade ago in research labs, and now playing out in real time across the American heartland. In 2015, a team of researchers at Columbia University's International Institute for Climate and Society Research published a study that should, by now, be on every meteorologist's desk. They didn't offer vague hypotheses. They used mathematics and decades of historical data to construct what we call the rule book. This research demonstrates that the Southern Oscillation, ENSO, geographically regulates extreme weather events in the United States in highly specific and predictable ways. The mechanism they identified wasn't a mysterious black box. It was a chain of direct physical consequences. Pacific sea surface temperatures regulate tropical convection patterns. That change affects the location and intensity of the Pacific jet stream, and as that jet stream spreads across North America, it will determine where troughs form, where moisture from the Gulf of Mexico is drawn in, and where the atmospheric atomic bomb will explode. The rulebook says, When the El Niño signal appears in the spring, severe weather tends to overwhelm the plains and Midwest, while being suppressed in the southeast. Look at what's happening in 2026. This isn't a relative coincidence. This is a terrifyingly perfect alignment. The atmosphere seems to be colouring exactly the areas science has been drawing for over a decade. What gives you goosebumps isn't the power of the storms, it's the fact that they're not random. Each outbreak on April 17th or April 23rd is a confirmation of a pre-written scenario. We are witnessing the predictive power of climate science unfolding in real time, turning a theory on paper into piles of rubble on the ground. But this is the part that is really keeping meteorologists awake at night. What we are seeing is only the beginning, because according to the rulebook, this scenario hasn't even reached its climax yet. To understand why the atmosphere behaves like a programmed machine, we must leave the Midwest and look thousands of miles away. There, in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, the real villain of this story lurks. Its name is ENSO, the Southern Oscillation. ENSO is not a single event, but a natural oscillation cycle between three states. El Niño with warmer than average surface water, La Niña with colder surface water, and a neutral state in between. Each of these phases sends different signals to the global atmosphere, forcing it to change the arrangement of energy and moisture on a large scale. Think of the Pacific Ocean as a giant thermostat. As sea surface temperatures change, it disrupts tropical convection patterns, thereby steering the location and intensity of the jet stream. This jet stream is the conveyor belt that directs storms. It determines where low-pressure troughs will erupt, where moisture from the Gulf of Mexico will converge, and where the atmospheric atomic bomb will explode. This is ENSO's ruthless rulebook. Under the influence of the El Niño signal, the jet stream is often repositioned to support tornado outbreaks in the American plains and Midwest in the spring. At the same time, it suppresses essential components in the southeast, leaving Dixie Alley unusually quiet. Conversely, the La Niña phase is often the culprit behind the devastating nighttime tornado tragedies in the southern states. Of course, the atmosphere is a turbulent fluid, and no rules are absolute. ENSO doesn't directly create individual tornadoes, but it creates a bias, a massive force that shapes an entire season. It is the most important modulator of the annual extreme weather variability in the United States. So, if you want to know why this year's storms aren't hitting the usual familiar places, don't just look at local radars. Look out over the Pacific Ocean first, because the Pacific is setting the pace, and by 2026, it's dictating how the atmosphere should act. If you thought what happened on April 17th or 23rd was the ultimate limit of the atmosphere, the truth may be even more devastating. Technically, we are still in a neutral state of ENSO, but it's a state that's rapidly warming up. Indicators are escalating and the Pacific is quietly accumulating a massive amount of energy just below the surface. Below sea level, a powerful Kelvin wave is propagating with temperature anomalies reaching up to plus 4 degrees Celsius. This isn't just a physical phenomenon, it's a harbinger. It indicates the ocean is loading up to push surface temperatures even higher in the coming months. And the atmosphere, a sensitive entity, isn't waiting for official indicators to cross the El Niño threshold before reacting. The atmosphere reads the ocean's state in real time. It has begun adjusting its circulation patterns based on what the Pacific Ocean is heading toward, not on what statistical reports are currently saying. What we are seeing is the behavior of pre-El Niño, a transitional phase where the atmosphere begins to adopt the devastating scenarios that El Niño typically produces. To put it bluntly and worryingly, what we have witnessed so far, 54 tornado reports in one afternoon, coordinated multi-hazard events, is just the appetizer. The main course will only truly begin when the El Niño signals fully develop and atmospheric coercion reaches its peak intensity. Current forecasts suggest a 70% chance that El Niño will take over completely this year. Even the risk of a super El Niño of maximum intensity has been put on the table with a 25% probability. If that happens, the weather patterns we're seeing now will not only continue, but be amplified to a whole new level. If the preparation phase can flatten neighborhoods in just 90 seconds, how devastating will the scenario be when the ocean actually commits completely? The answer doesn't lie in the forecast. It lies in whether we're alert enough to realize we're living in the opening pages of an increasingly grim script. For years, climate scientists have been quietly warning about a concept called compound events. This is a situation where multiple hazards occur simultaneously in the same space and time, or follow each other in a closely intertwined sequence. What we are witnessing in 2026 is not a single chain of risks. It is a textbook example of how disasters begin to coordinate to create a far greater overall impact than their individual components. You have to change your perspective on this system. It's not a series of separate weather events, but a multi-phase organism operating as a single entity. Tornadoes are just one limb, floods another, and frosts a third. They don't erupt randomly like scattered fireworks. They are a continuous conveyor belt powered by a powerful central engine. The frightening thing is that this pattern doesn't work in isolated environments. It is operating on a baseline that has completely changed over the decades. Components such as humidity, thermal energy, and wind shear are now more abundant than before. Therefore, the same El Niño signal from 30 years ago, when placed in the environment of 2026, will produce events with amplified intensity and destructiveness. A modern society can withstand a single strong blow, but when the blows begin to coordinate, when tornadoes destroy homes while blizzards hinder rescue efforts and floods cut off transportation routes, the system's resilience will crumble very quickly. The power grid, logistics systems, agriculture, and insurance industry are not designed to cope with the simultaneous onslaught of all weather extremes within the same time frame. The problem in 2026 is no longer simply strong storms. The problem is that the atmosphere has begun to systematically organize extreme weather events. This coordination is the defining characteristic of the new era, an era in which we are no longer dealing with misbehaving weather, but with a calculated campaign of destruction. Historically, meteorological forecasting has always been a shield. We believe that knowing what's coming makes us less afraid. But the 2026 tornado season is completely overturning that belief. Here, predictability doesn't bring reassurance, it brings terror. Because when disaster becomes entirely predictable, it's no longer an accident, it's a verdict. We often view weather as a symbol of randomness, of nature rolling dice in a chaotic manner. But in 2026, the atmosphere seems to have discarded those dice. It's no longer behaving lawlessly or throwing a tantrum. Instead, it's reading a script. A scenario structured enough to be recognizable, clear enough to match a study from over a decade ago, and stable enough to become an atmospheric regime. Chaos startles us because we can't predict it, but a cold, repetitive, and logical system frightens us in a far deeper way. It shows we're no longer dealing with a weather event, but with a machine. The precision of each reload every 6 to 8 days confirms that a macroscopic force, a massive energy-pressing mechanism, is controlling the rhythm of the entire continent. When the atmosphere adheres to this scenario with such precision, it sends a clear message. The ocean's coercion is too strong. It's so strong that it can suppress any ordinary disturbances to expose the devastating structure beneath. In this context, the accuracy of predictive models is not an achievement to celebrate, it is a warning sign. Chaos startles us, but accuracy is what keeps us awake at night, because it shows that the next chapter is not an unknown, but an inevitable one. We've been on a long journey of astonishment. Beginning with homes disappearing in 90 seconds in the Midwest, we realize that the system isn't ending. It's constantly recharging. We've seen an atmospheric machine producing 4 forms of destruction simultaneously, operating on a rhythm of 6 to 8 days, as precise as clockwork. We've seen the unusual silence of the southeast as the negative trace of a risk map being rewritten. What's happening in 2026 isn't a series of random meteorological events. It's a structured atmospheric regime. This isn't the chaotic hurricane season we know. It's a climate entity operating according to a scenario science has described for over a decade. The biggest question now isn't when the next outbreak will occur. The question is, how many more recharging cycles can our social system withstand? Before the land has dried, the crops have revived, and social nerves have stabilized, the atmosphere is preparing for a new cycle. This is a new kind of disaster, not only more powerful but relentless, unrelenting. The Pacific Ocean is still warming up, it's getting warmer, and shows no sign of stopping. If the warm-up phase has been this devastating, how far will the main El Niño chapter take us? The scenario is far from over, and the next chapters are being written by the ocean's temperature and the deformation of the currents right above us. 2026 is frightening. Not because it's chaotic, It's frightening because it's so orderly. When precision becomes the hallmark of natural disasters, prediction is no longer a comfort. It's the ultimate warning. We are living in a world where the old rules are dead, and a cold, new normal is beginning to operate. Don't just look at the radar, look at the patterns, because in this day and age, precision is what keeps us awake at night.